thumbs up that we're live. There it is. Good morning, everyone. That's nice and loud. I'm Catherine Bush here with Paul McLean and Scott Walters, your stalwart clergy team here at Calvary, and we're hoping today to have a conversation and really truly so get ready to be involved in this discussion about some of the one in particular, one of the lesser known pieces of our tradition. When we had a class a couple months ago about our favorite parts of the prayer book, one of y'all, I think, or borrowed the phrase that when the prayer book is well used, there tend to be some dirty pages in the middle. Is that you? Yeah. Dirty from use, not because they're inappropriate, right? These are some decidedly not dirty pages that we're going to be talking about today. You can see, there's kind of a line around 355.
Right around the communion service, there's a line from grubby fingers over the years.
Right.
The rest of it's pretty clean.
The rest of it's pretty clean. And these pages that we're going to be talking about today are particularly clean, partly because we don't use them very often. And when we do, we don't use them in corporate communal gatherings. They tend to be offered solo in ones and twos, or in kind of small off the track offerings. So we're going to be talking today about the rite of reconciliation, and depending on how time and conversation flows, we may also talk about the two offerings that follow in the prayer book: ministration to the sick and prayers at the time of death. So all of this starts in your prayer book on page 447. If you're interested in following along, it's not required. We're not going to do a spot check. But the reconciliation of a penitent is something that I think, especially our friends who have come into the Episcopal Church via other traditions, and notably the Roman Catholic tradition, that there's this sense of when and how do we do confession, right? What does that look like? And whether that's part of your tradition or not, or whether you've just seen it in the movies where somebody goes in a little dark closet and there's like a window that goes up and down, right? That we do have this opportunity and this really the gift of this prayer and the conversation that comes along with it for the reconciliation of a penitent. And it is particularly appropriate and often lifted up as we are during Lent, and even more so during Holy Week, as we prepare our hearts and we think about the season and where we are. I'm also aware that for those of you who have been coming, not to Paul's class upstairs, talking about mystics for the last several weeks, but those of us who've been gathering in here, talking about the 7 deadly sins, I'm a little bit more aware of all the ways that I go astray, thanks to some helpful conversation from our author that we were using, Elizabeth Oldfield. But we come into this conversation then with a lot of maybe our own histories, maybe our own baggage, and maybe our own curiosities. So we're going to kind of walk through what is offered and then talk a little bit about how we've experienced it, and how, not to betray anyone's confidence, but how it's been a part of our ministries, and then reflect together some. So with that as an offering, do you want to say anything just as we get started about kind of generally the...
Just name, I came from a very Protestant tradition, so it's a strange concept, and my assumption was that it meant priests had magical powers that other Christians didn't have to absolve sins, and so it was probably one of the more foreign ideas coming out of more evangelical circles to learn what is the theology behind how Episcopalians understand. Why in the world do we have it at all?
Right.
Will be an interesting question to talk about some today, I think.
Yeah. And actually, like Scott, I came from a more evangelical tradition, the Southern Baptist. And while a student at Ole Miss, my roommate, who's Roman Catholic, invited me to worship at St. John's Catholic, and got to know the priest there, Father Frank Cosgrove. In fact, I just wrote about him in my blog post. And I felt during that time of worshiping with the Catholics, perhaps I should do confession, and maybe that would be something good for me. And I talked to him about it, and I assumed he was going to invite me to the box that Catherine referred to. And he said, Paul, actually, I do most of my confessions not with the box, but just in my office, a face-to-face conversation. And he said, I said, I think I would prefer that. And we did that. And it was just really healing and powerful for me to do that. And you'll notice concerning the right page, you can do it in a more formal setting, and I've done that more. We don't have a box here, but I've had people ask if I would do it at the altar rail, where with me on one side, vested with a stole, and the other person on the other side of the altar rail, kneeling and saying their confession. But most of them take place in my office, and most people seem more comfortable with that. I will wear the stole, and everything will be kept in confidence. But just interesting that my first experience of that was in more of a conference-type setting.
Mm-hmm. And I think, so as we're telling our own backstory, so I grew up in the Episcopal Church day one. So neither borrowing from a Roman Catholic heritage nor coming into it from another tradition, it was still foreign to me, just to say that it was something that I didn't know was happening. And part of why I think we want to have this conversation today is that I think there's a sense of once you have availed yourself of this opportunity and gift, you might realize that it has a function and a place. But until you do it, it's something that you don't see, right? I didn't know that whether or not there were people lining up for this opportunity or not. It might have been mentioned as something that you could do in the bulletin, but it certainly wasn't. It wasn't kind of brought out into the fore in my growing up experience. It wasn't something that I shouldn't have seen it. But I do think that there's an interesting piece to connect with this. That what we're going to be talking about is the kind of one-on-one conversation between an individual and a clergy person. But of course, we actually all confess every Sunday, corporately, communally, together. We say the general confession and we receive absolution. And so to think a little bit about why, if we're doing that, why you might also want to consider this, and that they kind of take on a different tone and texture. So there's some different strands and different pieces of it to consider. So as both of them have said, and I think there is a sense of how we imagine it visually, their instructions give us a lot of flexibility for how it's a service. It has a liturgy and a form and practice to it. But again, it can happen, in an office. It can happen over a picnic table. It can happen in a church, side by side at the altar rail. And interesting even to think about those different spaces and how we position ourselves. So one of the things that I think is interesting that we might forget to consider, especially the more familiar you are with the Episcopal Church, is that we move our bodies around on purpose. We stand for certain things, we kneel for certain things, we sit, we walk forward, we walk back, we touch things. It's actually a very tactile physical faith, much as we kind of think of ourselves as only living up here. And so it's interesting to me to start with the idea that where this happens, where and how we're configured, and what those different places and spaces and the ways that we move our body might say to us. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, about position and place and your various experiences with that.
More often than not, folks have one. I think it's interesting that more often than not, folks have wanted to go into the church, and that makes some sense to me in this way. Our theology of forgiveness is quite Protestant. And the Protestant would be, one phrase is prevenient grace, and that means that God's grace goes ahead of us. God's grace is not waiting for us to get our confession right. Forgiveness is at the core of how God responds to the world. But that doesn't mean I can believe it. That doesn't mean I can trust it. And it's quite different if I'm just a guy who we're at coffee and I say, it's fine. Well, you've got one opinion. But the only reason I think that ordination makes any sense at all, in other words, so setting a few people to put flea collars on them and do certain things in the church, is to have somebody who's just represents all of y'all across time. And that's a much bigger community to hold something. If I've got something that I can't quite believe that when the mercy of God could actually hold this too, I can't let it, something in me can't quite accept it, then it's not enough to have somebody else's opinion. So sometimes that setting in the church, sometime I may need, I haven't had that much experience, it would make sense. I really want to hash this out in this context. But more often it's been, let's sit in the church, because people for almost 200 years have been saying their prayers in here. There's a sense of something larger than just the two of us holding what I'm entrusting. So in the same way that architecture always matters, we're interested in this room, what will happen in the years to come, because the architecture is different. It's just got a different kind of history. It's got a different kind, every room does something a little different. But I think it's not for nothing that question is allowed for us to have, but people can make all kinds of choices based on what might feel helpful to receiving the forgiveness that's already there. I'll say that probably 15 more times. This is a sacrament to help us receive the forgiveness that's already been offered. It's not to get God to pull a lever and say, all right, yep, page 449, got it, and pull that forgiveness lever. So,
yeah. And I agree. I think having it in the church kind of reminds us that we are not only representing God, but maybe representing the community, and the building setting brings you into that. That it's more of a communal, you're not only feeling God's forgiveness and absolution, but that of the community as well, and that we're feeling that maybe in a mutual way. So it has been powerful when I've done it at the altar rail, vested with someone either kneeling or sitting at the altar rail next to me, and we're making sure that the church is kind of, the doors are shut where it's private as can be, and we want it to be a private setting. And some people insist are more interested in the office, in my office, just because they know it will be a more private setting. And obviously the confidentiality of this is so important to people to feel that they can share anything. And but I agree with Scott too that it's something that's already offered. And I'm a fan of, as many of you are fans of Richard Rohr, and he once wrote, "God does not love us if we change. God loves us so we can change." So it's not the transaction of confession leads to, if I confess X, God loves me in Y way. It's more God already loves me, and God is loving me before all this, and God is loving me so that I can change. I can turn. Repent really means turn, and I can begin that turn. And
right, and I do think that this kind of like this cyclical circle of it, of who starts and what. I mean, God always has already started, right? That question is asked and answered, and we are responding. Not that we're waiting on God to respond to our. We said the right things, or we did it in the right order, or things like that. And I think also it's interesting to think about, again, just to stay for a moment in the structures of how and when it happens. Some of it depends on the nature of the conversation and how much and what a person wants to say and to offer, what they're coming to confess, to name, to say out loud, and how and when they might do that. There's a long story that goes with that, as there often is. Then maybe start, more conversationally, maybe in an office, maybe in a space like that, and then perhaps make a move to say, okay, now I've kind of excised some of this and said it out loud, and then the move to, well, this is actually, and this is a point that I want to make too, this is actually different from therapy, right? Like therapy has a role, and I'm for it, and yes, and this is not the same thing as that. That our therapeutic relationships with our counselors and the people who guide us, maybe through a situation over a long haul. Not that your clergy are not prepared to walk with you over a long haul. There's just a different purpose, right? That this is ultimately about receiving, as Scott said, forgiveness. That might come to you. You might discover that in a really good therapy session. But this is what we're here for. This is why we're doing this. Is to make that known. And to be able to believe it, I think.
If you want to, we'll get to this eventually, but if you want to hear a fabulous sermon on what we're talking about, go back and listen to the very first Lenten preaching sermon this year by Paul Fromberg. And he quoted a 4th century Eastern desert father But what the phrase that Paul said, it was talking about the mercy of God, and he talked about waking up in the middle of the night and my mind going over everything I've done wrong. And the things I can't undo, he said. And he said, you know what I realized is that something in me would rather be anxious than receive the mercy of God. Something in me would rather be anxious than receive the mercy of God. And it's just so poignant to me to hear Paul talk about that in this sermon, which does signal it's hard to receive mercy. Right? It's hard. It's hard because we want to be our best. We want to expect things of each other and all of this, but it was a really helpful sermon to me. You can go back and find it, but I really think it gets at what we're talking about here, this process of receiving.
Yeah, and I think that acceptance of the mercy is, not only hard because we want to present something else, but often sometimes we get kind of wed to the identity, even when it's a bad identity. We can hold on to, I'm this person who did that thing, and actually I can prefer that story over what might come next if I were to shed that. This is kind of what this Paul was saying a minute ago about then the movement comes in my life because of God's love, right? So then so when we say things like, now you have to go and do the work, it's not in this transactional way, but just you are called forth by this love to believe that you are different, and if you believe that you are different, then to be different.
Well, sorry. The last quote that it reminded me of is that Lewis Hyde said, forgiveness is losing attachment to your wounds. Forgiveness is losing attachment to my wounds, to your point there.
Yeah, and that's what often when in doing this right, uncovering what maybe the real sin is of someone, and often in my own sin, is holding on to something where I'm unwilling to forgive myself. And sometimes I've learned that people are willing to accept the absolution of God, the absolution of their priest, even the absolution of the person they've offended, but still won't forgive themselves and will hold on to it. And we did talk in our Praying with the Mystics class a little bit about the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is more, I did this action and I really regret it and I hurt someone. And shame is, I did this action and I'm a bad person. I'm really, there's something wrong about me, and everyone sees it. Yeah, and technically, I think we can obviously absolve you from guilt, and it's a little easier absolve to move on to say that was an action, and that's behind me. And I'm moving on. I'm saying making amends for that. But this idea that there's something wrong with me, that's harder work. Yeah.
So there are two forms that we're given, and the difference is mostly length and how much scripture there is included. So there's form 1, which is, if you've got a prayer book nearby, is on page 447, where the penitent begins, "Bless me, for I have sinned." The priest says, "The Lord be in your heart, that you may truly and humbly confess your sins." The penitent says, "I confess to Almighty God, to his church, and to you, I've sinned by my own fault in thought, word, and deed, and things done and left undone, especially blank." And this is really the turn from what we do on Sundays, right, where we make a general confession, and it's all-encompassing, and it tends to cover most of what I've done, right? And I might, in the quiet of my heart, even as I'm saying the words out loud, know, oh, right, it's the thing that I said to the person, it's the harm that I did. I can call that to mind, but I'm saying a prayer with a group of people, and I'm not voicing that in that particular moment, even if I'm calling it to my own memory and mind. So the opportunity here, that one of the first things that makes this different from what we do collectively is, especially blank, is to name, to tell the story, to say it out loud. And this is where we do start to see why we know that things that are beneficial to us in other settings, like in therapy or like in a family meeting or however else we might benefit from saying the hard thing out loud, kind of, starts to diminish its power and all of these things. And we know that, and we see that in other settings, and we see it here primarily in this, okay, this is what I came here. I've never said this out loud, or I've only whispered this. I've been carrying this by myself. The only other person who knows is the person I harm, and the kind of pulling back the curtain, and having someone on behalf of the church and the community, as we've said, bear witness to that. That's really what we're doing, is we're witnessing that, and then telling you what is already true, which is that God forgives you. We're not, again, it's not magic necessarily, not magic at all. So that we have that moment. And then, in a poignant piece of humility too, for these and all other sins which I cannot now remember, I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. And that what I have actually forgotten, what I never knew that I did that hurt you, what I've swept under the rug, what happened so long ago, right? That is, again, we get these kind of catch-all moments. I pray to God to have mercy on me. I firmly intend amendment of life. I beg forgiveness of God and of his church, and I ask you for counsel, direction, and absolution. And then that's the conversation that proceeds from there.
I mean, one of the other difference is that in church we say we, and in this one I say I. And so that we every week say we is a reminder to me that sometimes we can have an overly individualistic idea of sin and failure. It's this interior flaw in an individual, but from the beginning it's broken relationship, right? How have relationships broken down? How do I participate in that? And then how do I pass it along so that what Catherine was saying, even the sins I can't remember might still be doing harm, right? It's the things that I do can keep hurting people. I may not know about it. And so that humility to say, there might still be something out there. The old phrase, hurt people, I know that I'm passing on my hurts in certain ways, and I might not know it. So the humility is powerful just in kind of understanding how brokenness moves through our lives.
And sometimes when I'm meeting with someone and they have a difficult time articulating just very quickly their sins, a little litany of it, I'll say when we reach the especially part, you could just say especially those sins that we're about to discuss through story. And we'll do the rest of it, and then when we get to hear the priest may offer counsel, direction, and comfort, I'll say, well, tell me the story. And they'll begin, and the story, again, sins may be uncovered in the story that are difficult for the person to express, and they may be different than the ones they thought they were coming into the confession with.
Right. Yes, often the case. Yeah. So that conversation, then in our little bitty font with our rubrics lines, right? Here the priest may offer counsel, direction, and comfort. The reminder of God's love. If there is, so sometimes it's the case that the story that's told, the sin that's being brought forward, has a clear implication and a kind of an obvious, like, have you said this to the person that you heard? I mean, you can say it to me, and that's quote unquote enough, but might you consider also addressing this with the person you're in relationship with, or the person that the relationship is now broken? Are there things that you might want to do, not transactionally to earn, not like here's a checklist and come back to me and then I'll offer you the absolution, but absolution happens, and what is next? How are you changed by remembering that you were a beloved child of God, no matter what, and what might we together discover would be meaningful, whether that is addressable to a real person or not because of circumstance, and then what might you do that would help you receive and believe that this absolution has been given to you?
Which is, if there's any wisdom beneath penance, it's not as punishment. Mm-hmm. Is there an embodied action that could help me internalize, let go, help this hurt let go of its grip on me? I don't want to pass it along. I know I respond in this way when that soft spot in me gets touched. So sometimes penance could be some enacted thing. Did you ever see The Mission? That movie, it's a powerful movie. And when, is it Robert De Niro? He gets to the top, climbs to the top. He's trying to make his peace with this awful past he has with some enslaved folks and a native person. He's got his armor, he's carrying it up, and the native person cuts the ropes and pushes the armor of his past life of enslavement over the edge. And and he weeps. You could just see this embodied release of maybe even I could move into the future, and maybe my sins wouldn't have to keep defining me. And anyway, sorry, rather than punishment, what's an embodied action that could help me live in fuller relationship is a better kind of my understanding.
Yeah, and it's interesting. In the second form of the confession, which we'll probably get to in a moment, it gets into a lot of the text of the prodigal son parable. And Robert Capon, who's written books about the parables, I love what he has to say about confession. It really changed a lot of my thinking about it. But he wrote, "Confession is not a medicine leading to recovery. If we could recover, we could say that beginning tomorrow or the week after next, we would be well again. Why then all we would need to do would be to apologize, not confess. We would simply say that we were sorry about the recent unpleasantness, but that thank God and the resilience of our better instincts, it is all over now. We could confidently expect that no one but a real nasty would say us nay. But we never recover. We die. And we live again, and it's not because the old parts of our life are jiggled back into line, but because, without waiting for realignment, some wholly other life takes up residence in our death. Grace does not do things tit for tat. It acts finally and fully from the start." That was really powerful, I think, because we can see confession, we can see reconciliation as taking us back to something that we're an idealized thing, that this is what recovery or what healing is. It takes us back to this. But really it's about moving forward to something that you've got a completely new life. You've died to that old life. One of the great things I've been asked to do twice is two couples who have went through a divorce contacted me and said, "We have reconciled years later, many years later in both cases." And they said, "We want you to officiate our wedding, but we want to do it on the same date we were married before, so we only have one anniversary." But the only thing that is the same, really, that I discover when I do premarital counseling with these couples is that date, because they're changed people. They're more mature in their love. They've got they understand, they've been through something, a crucible together, and there are a lot of things that didn't work the first time around, obviously, that they don't want to be a part of the relationship the second time around. They understand some skills about communicating better, understanding each other. Self is less important to each one of them. The other is more important, and others outside of the relationship are more important. So it's really been powerful to see that second marriage as just a complete turn of, it almost is like a new couple is being married.
Yeah, interesting. I think too this. So the rest of this, again, of the first form, which is the shorter of the two, the pronounces absolution. We're given two sets of phrases that we might choose from, and then. For me, one of the most poignant and simplest lines, "The Lord has put away all your sins." They're just put away. They're just, and that, the simplicity of that, and then the penitent says, "Thanks be to God." And then I think maybe to Paul's point about we're not looking backwards. We're not reverting backwards. We're going forward. Go in peace. And then again, as a reminder of the humanity of the people who wear the funny shirts and the stoles and such, go in peace and pray for me, a sinner. I'm not standing up here listening to you as somebody who doesn't sin, right? I'm not standing above you on some pedestal of, as if I have not hurt and thought and done and said, all the things, right? And so that leveling, that moment right at the close of, we're all in this together, right?
I'm curious, does anybody have a deep, dark sin you'd like to confess to the whole? No. Just to pause for some reflections, though. We've kind of talked about big picture. We've talked about some of the right. Does it bring questions up from your own stories that you'd like to?
Or questions about how some things.
On.
Yeah, we
can.
Or
particular questions.
Yeah, questions about.
This is kind of just a practical question, not having grown up in this denomination. So do people just call you and say, "I'd like to schedule this"? Do they stop you? Is there a time of the year? Obviously Lent, but this is not something that's ever crossed my mind, so I wouldn't even know how to initiate.
Yeah. The answer is just call or text. But there's also we haven't done this here. When I was serving at the cathedral years ago, I'm trying to think if it was on, I think it was on Good Friday. Before and after the noon service, we just said, we're here to do this. So they're at like 30-minute increments. You could just walk in, and it was available. And several of us, there were a couple of us on staff at the cathedral at that time, and it's not that there was a line out the door, but there was a sense of, it takes a lot to call somebody and say, right, like, could you do this with me? Could I? But it's kind of like, it's just there. Come. You don't have to make a big deal about it. Like, you didn't. That kind of like taking away the need to initiate seemed to invite some folks in. But the answer is, yeah, you just say, I'd like to. And oftentimes it comes, it's maybe, I don't want to put stories or words in either of y'all's mouth, from an earlier conversation, that there's something there that started maybe in a pastoral care situation or another, that it becomes like, and I'm not prone myself to say, you might want to consider the reconciliation of the penitent. But sometimes it seems like the next right thing to do.
Yeah, I think a lot of times you can feel something bubbling up within you that you need to do this, and you can call any one of us to make an appointment or come in and see us and do it in the church or in our office, whichever makes more sense to us together. But I think too, to adopt this as a spiritual practice. I'm part of a rule of life from the Fellowship of St. John. Some of you may be parts of monastic third orders where you adopt sort of a rule of life in conjunction with the monks. You don't do everything that they do, but you take on some of the things that they do. And one of the things this rule says, you are to say your confession during Advent and Lent, during those two seasons, as a spiritual practice. And even if maybe you don't have anything bubbling up during particularly those two seasons or whenever you want to pick for a year, it's almost like an oil change on your car, just, something else. I think it's good to go in. What you will define if you do a moral inventory before that setting. Well, I haven't done anything that I know of that was really bad. But maybe as you think of it, wait a minute, what about these systematic sins that I've been involved in? What about things related to my buying practices or my economic practices, or how I've treated, or how our company or our nonprofit or whatever has treated people at work in some ways maybe that we shouldn't have? As you really reflect on that, you'll think there's something beyond maybe just your personal badness that bubbles up. That there's something deeper that's surfacing, and that would be worthwhile to confess and talk about.
These guys have heard me tell this story a number of times because it really affected me. When we were in seminary, Scott and I overlapped. They were putting out alternative new liturgies and try this prayer, and you might want to do this. And this is when Enriching Our Worship, which is a supplemental text, came forward. And there's a confession in there that said, things done and left undone, and things done on my behalf, that I needed to confess that. And there was people didn't like it. They didn't want to confess things done on our behalf, right? I didn't want to say, I can confess. So this is exactly what Paul's saying about the things that we're involved in and implicitly or explicitly caught up in these nets. And it was very interesting to watch folks' response to, I don't like that line. I don't want that. That's not my fault that this company, uses this kind of labor practice. And yet we are involved. And this goes back to the we language versus the I language of the general confession. So anyway.
Yeah, my experience of that particular line at seminary was really interesting. There was a theologian named Rowan Greer, who was like, if central casting, I was told that in his office at Yale he would bring his golden retriever with him and he smoked a pipe, and it was so it's like central casting, hadn't even heard of Enriching Our Worship, and and he came to lecture, and that question came up, but he had just lectured on John Wesley's theology of sin, And it absolutely said that a Christian understanding of sin, there are things that I've done, there are things that I've left undone, there are things that are done on my behalf. A lot of sin in the Christian story and the Jewish story is what flows across generations and through the law gets into economics right away because the way we spend our time and our money and our land, how we own land. So it was really interesting that this fusty theologian, Ish. I mean, he's a lovely guy. He's a wonderful guy. But he did not fit the type for someone. Let's go out to the edges of what the Christian tradition might say about sin. He's like, no, this is core.
Right.
Stuff done on our behalf is part of the problem.
Well, and I think this also often comes up. It's kind of our larger cultural conversation about like what kind of storytelling is going to happen in our schools. How do we tell history? Right? We don't want our kids to feel bad, so we're not going to tell these stories, right? And I know that our collective experience in doing the 87 Adams work has been that when we have come together to tell the story of what happened at Calvary, a long time before any of us were in charge, by the way, which would be really tempting to say, like, we weren't here, we didn't walk past a slave market that was active, Again, I want to say, like, that was then, this is, to distance ourselves from that, but we've been telling the story and calling it forward into the present, and rather than that leading to just morose, downtrodden, shame-filled conversations, these gatherings, y'all, have been full of levity and light and, dare I say, joy, and the storytelling that has come out of that, and the connections and the relationships that we have been able to repair and rebuild with neighbors around that is just, it's gorgeous. And there's a sense of just this kind of the light that comes, the truth will set you free, right? This is how it works. The truth, saying the truth will set you free. So again, I think we have these ideas of, a dark box and a beating ourselves up and penance list and all this, but in fact, what comes is this, we embodied sense of, I can live in the world differently now. I can walk with integrity, and I can be in relationship now in a way that I had boxed off and prohibited myself from.
Yeah, one of our Lenten preaching speakers in recent years was Catherine Meeks, who helped form the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing, and we just learned that she's coming to preach here in September. And she said that when they co-founded this institution, they were very intentional in the name. Many people wanted to call it the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Reconciliation. And she argued, no, it should be called the Center for Racial Healing, but she argued that a relationship did not occur in the first place. That this was more about healing and maybe creating new relationships. She said everything was really based on force, not even really based on transaction, but really based on force and power. And it was really not a real relationship, did not exist. And so the excitement of that is we're creating something new. We're not going back to an idealized relationship, because apparently there really wasn't one. And so there, in that, there's something life-giving about that is true, something almost a phoenix rising from the ashes, something new is emerging from 87 Adams, from the work that we are doing together in Sacred Ground, other things. And so I think that can be powerful.
Other reflections or questions or comments? Yeah.
I'm really taking this out of there. I'm thinking about a person who is in prison, a person who has committed a heinous crime. Has God already forgiven them for that crime? They're in the institution. Perhaps a clergy person has come in and they've confessed to that crime and they're very sorry for it, but yet the penal institution has decided that they're going to either have them electrocuted or shot or something, or they're just going to be in jail for the rest of their lives. Is that just way out there for me to be asking that?
That's a valid question. But it is important to think in terms of, this is me talking, but my theology is, yes, forgiveness has happened. In other words, the grip of that evil in the world doesn't live in the heart of God. there absolutely are times when we have to protect one person from another. It's heartbreaking. It happens every now and then for community ministries. We realize that someone's acted out and they've hurt somebody. And so we say, I'm sorry you can't be in this space because this happened. Not almost. Every time someone hurts somebody in this world, upstream, they got hurt. Every single person in 201 Poplar, you can look in their story, and that sins, they go way upstream. So when we think of sins, I think when we get a punishment mindset that's like the Merchant of Venice, that God wants to extract a pound of flesh to pay a debt, is utterly unbiblical, unchristian. There is nothing in the heart of God that is waiting for someone to suffer enough. And frankly, the Hebrew scriptures, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, what they said was no more than an eye. No more than an eye for an eye. No more than a tooth for a tooth. If a teenager steals your television, you can't shoot him. That's Old Testament theology. So this is something that goes really deep in me. When we think about the reality of sins as brokenness that move through me, that I end up passing on the hurts that I've suffered, that I haven't dealt with, that I haven't figured out what to do with, when I can't lose attachment to my own wounds, that's just a very different approach to even I think we need to have some real conversations about how we do justice in the world that has a lot more to do with who needs to be protected, how can we do that, and if we could get away from punishment, if we get away from the sense that once we've inflicted a sufficient amount of pain on this person because pain happened over here, I think we could have a really much wider conversation on how to actually heal as a community. As long as I need to get even, as long as I'm counting that up, I think I'm just sending too much of my creativity down in that. Do we need to protect people from people? Absolutely. And sometimes it needs to be physical protection. Sometimes it needs to be, I'm sorry, you can't go over there because you hurt her. And Jesus wants me to make sure she doesn't get hurt again. That's not the same as inflicting extra punishment on the person who hurt for the sake of the pain. Does that make sense? Is that some of the kind of that you're asking about? Okay.
And I think
sorry for the mini sermon, but
Well, I had a chance to actually go to 201 Poplar about a month or two ago, and I wrote about this, I was asked to take communion to a prisoner whose name, ironically, was Glenn Campbell. And I said, well, I've always wanted to meet Glenn Campbell. And it so happened that day that he's an older Episcopal prisoner who had been taken to a medical appointment, unbeknownst to me. And they said, well, we'd still like you to do communion for those who are assembled. I'm going to see if there are a few of the guys who want to come out for communion. About 15 guys came out. Fortunately, I had enough communion for everybody. And after communion, the volunteer coordinator asked he said, some of the guys would like to say their confession to you. And would you be willing to do that? And he set up just kind of a couple of chairs off in a corner, and every one of them came forward and wanted to do private confession with me. And it was just really powerful. They became individuals to me. One of them has continued to write to me. We still are corresponding. Another shared with me that he may feel a call to ministry himself from his experiences in prison. But they became real people. I got to know their names, and they were no longer people who just warehouse that are away from us. And I was thinking, too, the way we go eat in a restaurant, the people who prepare our meal are completely separate from us. We don't see them. The people who've wronged us in whatever way, we want out of our lives, and maybe we need them out of our lives for our personal safety, but we don't want any interaction with them. But I love some of the Native American concepts of restorative justice, where you actually connect with the person who has wronged you, and they make amends, really, and you have some interaction there that's really part of restoring each of you. And there's something powerful about the belief in that. I don't know if we could ever get there.
It's really interesting when you look at the practices of restorative justice. And there are models of it all over the country. There's a little bitty model of it in our own juvenile court system. I think it's still operational at some level here. But the idea is, again, it's this. It's that I might say to the person that I wronged, let me tell you my story, you hear mine. We are in relationship with each other. And then the question is asked, what is needed? What would make the victim, what do they want? And sometimes I just want you to say, I'm sorry, I really want my car back, but my car's whatever, that we get to name those things and whether that's possible or not. But the restorative justice model is there, and it is this, and it sounds impractical, and it sounds like, oh, that would never really work at scale, and that wouldn't work for the worst of the worst. There are all these reasons not to do it, but actually what we see is that it's terrifically impactful in terms of changing people's lives and decreasing recidivism, which means that they won't offend again. It actually works. And so there are little glimpses and experiments of this. And what's so interesting for us to think about, your question, Kate, is about, why isn't the penal system more like the church? Which is valid, but there's a different system, right? They're not operating with our values. The question for us is, how can we make sure that the church is not like a penal system, right? Like, how do we, operate in a sense of abundance and grace and mercy, and when necessary, say, boundaries. You can come here, but you can't come. Again, to Scott's point, there are moments where we have to keep vulnerable people safe and safe from each other. But those kind of boundaries and consequences to action don't have to be overbearing and overdone. And that they can always say, and we'll revisit this. So when we have to tell someone that they can't come in for a while, let's take a pause. It's not forever. It's not the end of the story. It's the next chapter of the story looks like this.
Other thoughts, questions, sins?
I grew up Methodist, and when we moved back to Memphis years ago, everybody that the kids kept meeting at school went to Holy Communion. I thought, I can't go there. That's Catholic. They got the boxes. I had no idea. And literally, the liturgy when we stepped in was just like the Methodist Church. It was home. And I remember saying to Gary Jones, beloved priest years ago, I wish you had the box because I wanted that. And he said, oh, we got the box. And the box became, this place where coming in, my pages are not dirty in that part of my book, but it's probably some of the most powerful times that I've ever shared, because my judgment will kill me, and there was no judgment. It was big teary. It was so beautiful. And, sorry, I've been away for like 7 months, so coming home it's big. But in these 7 months, it's been a time of isolation, like the craziest isolation with a brand new grandbaby. And 12 hours a day, I was watching this little baby grow every day, every day, every day. And every day I took a picture of this little, head against my chest. And every time I would feel like this is the DNA of my daddy. This is the DNA of my mom. And my mom didn't want me, my dad didn't want me when I was born. And what is it like to hold a baby? This wanted. And this healing that started happening. So, but at the same time, I was torn with the absence of community and such incredible isolation that all of my stuff started coming up. And so just to sum it up real quick, 40 days ago, I heard this voice say, for 1 minute a day, are you willing to step into the wilderness and listen? And that's what I've done, me and 62 different bird species, thanks to the Merlin app, 2 bobcats, a flamingo flying over my head, all kinds of crazy stuff. But within that, this whole concept of to reconcile what's within, because so much of my harm has been to myself instead of what I would say to another. And that is a place where I see this door open to step into. So if y'all do a sign-up list, I'd like one of those. But I just want to say, sitting with someone in the complete absence of judgment, the words are the words, but it's the love that I remember from like Gary Jones all those years ago, where I said things I thought I could never say to anybody. And he just looked at me and held the mercy till I could carry it, because that's not my forte. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. How does it can be hard work to let go.
Thank you. And that leads me to think about what we say and the work that we do with the women of Thistle and Bee, that in order, one of the many things that has to happen for them to be able to turn their lives around is to learn to love and trust themselves enough to learn to love and trust others.
Right. I mean, I do think this holding mercy until we can receive it and receiving mercy so that we can give it. I mean, it does become reconciling in the, I mean, even in the almost financial language of that, of like evening out the big spreadsheet. I mean, again, we're trying to get away from all this transactional language, but this sense of like just putting more of that in the world so there's more of that to go around, and reminding ourselves and each other that this is the water we swim in. This is the air we breathe, is the air of mercy and forgiveness, and it's possible for you and for me. And so we have these large gatherings, church, we say the things, and we also have these more intimate moments where it can maybe get inside us a little differently. So,
You know, as we roll into Holy Week, to your point, you know, there's a lot that can feel like punishment is being meted out on Jesus so we don't have to be punished. That's been a story that's been told, and it's just, I don't know what I'll preach on Easter, but behind everything I preach would be, when Rowan Williams describes the crucifixion, he describes it as planting a flag out at the furthest extremes of human awfulness and saying, even this won't drive you away to God. Like God saying, even this will not drive you away. It's hard to imagine something beyond that pale. And
Right.
rather than, I'm going to execute him so I don't have to execute you,
Yeah.
no, it's not that at all. It's saying, even in this will not drive me away. I'm still in love with humanity. I'm still forgiving. I'm still...
Paul talked about
Right.
Richard Rohr earlier. I know we're getting close to the end of our time, and I've heard Richard Rohr. He's quoting someone else, and I can't remember now who he's quoting, but that's the thread. That's the through line. And he says that Jesus didn't come to change God's mind about humanity. Jesus came to change humanity's mind about God. Didn't come to change God's intention to be retributive or violent toward us or to step in and catch the blow instead of us. Didn't come to do that, but came instead to change our minds about how far the love of God reaches, how broad, how big, how merciful. That's been a really helpful way, because there's a lot of language, and some of it is extracted from the Bible, of this kind of like this the atonement theory that is very, very punitive, and the language is difficult. But so again, that Jesus didn't come to change God's mind about us. Jesus came to change our minds about God. See you upstairs.